The morning sun was just beginning to cast its golden rays over the bustling private airport. People in tailored suits and sunglasses moved with purpose, while sleek jets gleamed on the runway. Among them stood Shaquille O'Neal, a towering figure both in stature and fame. His presence alone could command attention anywhere he went, but Shaq wasn't the type to boast about his celebrity status. Today, he was dressed casually, basketball shorts, a hoodie, and sneakers. A duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he was ready for a trip that he had planned weeks ago. Shaq had been on countless flights, private and commercial. He had experienced the best and worst of airport services, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. He approached a small check-in booth where a security guard, neatly dressed in a crisp uniform, stood behind a counter. At first glance, the guard seemed like any other, stern-faced and professional, the type who took his job a little too seriously. But as Shaq got closer, something about the man's demeanor shifted. The guard's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his posture stiffened as if he had just spotted trouble. "Can I help you?" the guard asked curtly, barely looking up from his clipboard. Shaq smiled politely, not wanting to make a scene. "Yeah, I'm here for flight 207. It's my jet." The guard raised an eyebrow, his gaze now fixed on Shaq. There was no trace of friendliness in his expression. "Your jet?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You mean your asterisk flying on that jet?" Shaq nodded, keeping his cool. "That's right." The guard set his clipboard down and folded his arms, his expression hardening further. "I'm going to need some identification," he said, his voice cold. Shaq pulled out his ID and handed it over. The guard took it, his eyes scanning the document for an unusually long time. It wasn't a casual glance. It was as if he were searching for a reason to deny Shaq access. When he finally looked up, his face twisted into a smug grin. "This can't be right," he said. "You sure this is your jet?" For a moment, Shaq was taken aback. He had dealt with skepticism before, people doubting his achievements or underestimating his abilities, but this felt different. There was an edge to the guard's tone, a subtle but unmistakable judgment. "Yes," Shaq replied firmly. "This is my jet. Is there a problem?" The guard hesitated, as if weighing his options. Then he stepped out from behind the counter and stood in front of Shaq, blocking his path. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he said, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of others nearby. "We have protocols to follow. You can't just walk in here claiming you own a jet." Shaq glanced around, noticing the curious stares from bystanders. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't about protocol. It was personal. He had seen this kind of behavior before, the way some people made assumptions based on appearances. But he wasn't about to let it slide. "Look," Shaq said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I've got the paperwork, the flight details, everything. If you need to verify something, go ahead. But don't stand here acting like I don't belong." The guard's eyes flickered with a mix of anger and satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for Shaq to push back. "I said step aside," he barked, his voice echoing across the terminal. By now, a small crowd had gathered, whispering among themselves. Some recognized Shaq and looked on in disbelief, while others seemed unsure of what was happening. The tension in the air was palpable. Shaq took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had dealt with challenges on and off the court, but this was different. This wasn't about skill or strategy. It was about dignity. He knew he had to handle the situation carefully. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to get to my flight. Can we handle this professionally?" But the guard wasn't listening. He was too busy enjoying the power he thought he had over the situation. He stepped even closer, his face inches from Shaq's, and sneered. "You think you're special because you're tall and famous. Rules are rules, and right now, you're not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. For a moment, Shaq felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had worked hard to get where he was, overcoming obstacles most people couldn't imagine. And yet he was, being treated like he didn't belong, like he had to prove himself all over again. But Jacques wasn't one to lose his composure easily. He knew better than to escalate the situation. Instead, he took a step back and said, "All right, if that's how you want to play it, let's get your supervisor involved. I'm not going to stand here arguing with you." The guard smirked, clearly unfazed. "Good luck with that," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." As Jacques waited for the supervisor to arrive, he couldn't help but wonder. Was this just a case of one man's ego, or was there something deeper at play? Either way, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. What happened next would shock everyone, including the guard who thought he could hold Shaquille O'Neal back. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of the tension as Shaquille O'Neal stood there, waiting for the guard's supervisor to arrive. The air was thick with whispers, some people sneaking glances at the towering basketball legend, others openly staring. Jacques could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and disbelief swirling the crowd. He shifted his weight, his massive frame making even the polished floor creak softly. Despite the quiet hum of jet engines in the distance, everything else felt eerily still. The guard, whose name tag read Eric, was still standing there, arms crossed, with a smug grin plastered on his face. Eric seemed to enjoy the commotion, as if he thrived on the power of keeping someone as famous as Shaquille O'Neal at bay. Jacques could tell this wasn't just about enforcing airport security protocols. It was personal. He'd been around long enough to recognize that tone, the type of disdain that had nothing to do with the situation in hand. As Jacques stood there, he replayed the interaction in his head. He wasn't sure what had triggered Eric's behavior. Was it the way he dressed? Did Eric not recognize him? Or was this about something deeper? Jacques had always prided himself on staying cool under pressure. He had dealt with critics, doubters, and naysayers his entire life. But something about this moment felt different. This wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about fame. It was about respect, or the lack of it. A man in a suit approached, breaking Jacques' train of thought. His name tag read Martin, and he walked with a certain authority that suggested he was the supervisor. Martin's expression was neutral, but as he got closer and recognized Jacques, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neal," Martin said, extending a hand. "I'm Martin, the head of airport security. I understand there's been some kind of issue." Jacques shook his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Afternoon," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "Yeah, there seems to be some confusion about my flight. Your guy here doesn't believe this is my jet." He gestured toward Eric, who stood a few steps back, his arms still folded. Martin turned to Eric, his expression now tinged with slight annoyance. "Eric, did you check his credentials?" "I did," Eric said defensively, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. "But it didn't add up. I mean, come on, look at him." He motioned towards Jacques, as if the mere sight of him was proof enough that he didn't belong. Martin's brows furrowed. What exactly is the issue here? "Well," Eric stammered, I don't think he." "Stop," Martin interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let me see the ID." Eric handed it over, his reluctance obvious. Martin studied the card, then glanced back at Jacques. It was clear he recognized the name and face instantly. The tension in his shoulders relaxed, but his jaw tightened, as though he was silently reprimanding himself for the situation. "This is valid," Martin said after a beat. "And yes, this is Shaquille O'Neal." He turned to Eric, his tone sharp now. "You didn't think to verify this further before escalating." Eric's face reddened, but he didn't back down entirely. "I was just following procedure," he mumbled. "Following procedure isn't the issue here," Martin shot back. He turned to Jacques again, his demeanor apologetic. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. O'Neal. I'll personally make sure you're cleared to board." Jacques appreciated the apology, but something about the situation still didn't sit right. He wasn't someone who threw around his fame to get special treatment, but this wasn't about fame. It was about being treated with the same respect as anyone else. "Thanks," Jacques said, nodding at Martin. But I've got to ask, why was there an issue in the first place? I've flown out of this airport plenty of times and never had a problem like this before. Martin hesitated, glancing at Eric. I can't speak for my team's individual decisions, he said carefully, his words measured. But I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Shaq wasn't entirely satisfied with the response, but he decided to let it go for now. He just wanted to get on the jet and put the whole ordeal behind him. Martin gestured toward the gate, signaling that Shaq was free to proceed. But as Shaq walked past Eric, he caught the guard muttering something under his breath. Some people think they're above the rules, Eric said, loud enough for Shaq to hear, but quiet enough to feign innocence if called out. Shaq paused mid-step, his back still to Eric. He considered turning around, but instead he took a deep breath and kept walking. Confronting Eric wouldn't change his mindset. It would only add fuel to a fire that didn't need stoking. Still, the comment lingered, a small sting that cut deeper than Shaq expected. Once on the jet, Shaq finally allowed himself to relax. The plush leather seats, the quiet hum of the cabin. Everything about the private plane was designed for comfort. But even here, in this space meant for luxury and ease, Shaq couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the jet taxied to the runway. He thought about the countless times he had faced moments like this. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, he'd learned early on that the world wasn't always fair. But his mother had taught him to hold his head high, to rise above the negativity and focus on what he could control. It was a lesson that had carried him through his career, from his college days at LSU to his time in the NBA, where he became one of the most dominant players in history. But no matter how much success he achieved, there were still moments that reminded him he wasn't immune to prejudice or judgment. Moments like this, where he was reduced to stereotypes, where his accomplishments and character were overlooked in favor of assumptions. The jet began to ascend, the city shrinking below him as clouds filled the sky. Shaq closed his eyes, trying to push the encounter with Eric out of his mind. But he couldn't help but wonder, why had Eric been so quick to judge him? Was it ignorance, bias, or something else entirely? And why had Martin, despite his apology, been so hesitant to fully address the issue? As the jet leveled out and the seatbelt sign turned off, Shaq opened his eyes and reached for his phone. He scrolled through his messages, trying to distract himself. But one message stood out, a text from his agent, Rick. "Call me when you're airborne," it read. "We need to talk." Shaq frowned, his curiosity piqued. Rick wasn't one to send cryptic messages. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, Rick picked up. "Hey, big guy," Rick said, his tone serious. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Shaq replied, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "What's going on?" Rick hesitated, and Shaq could hear the tension in his voice. "I just got a call from someone at the airport," he said finally. "They told me about the incident with the guard." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. "What about it?" "There's more to it than you think," Rick said. "I did some digging and, well, let's just say this isn't the first time the guard has pulled something like this." Shaq's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's a pattern," Rick said, his voice grim. "And it's not just you. We need to talk about what to do next." Shaq leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Shaq's mind reeled as he gripped his phone, Rick's words hanging heavily in the air. A pattern. It wasn't just him. He had encountered unfair treatment before, but the idea that this guard, Eric, might have a history of such behavior opened a door to something much bigger than he anticipated. Shaq had always been a person who stood up for what was right, but now he found himself wondering how far this situation really went. "What kind of pattern are we talking about?" Shaq asked, his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. Rick hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't have all the details yet, but I've heard whispers from some contacts. There's been complaints, similar situations involving other high-profile individuals. Some even mention race being a factor, though nothing's ever been formally proven. It seems like the guy has a chip on his shoulder." Shark exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat. He had seen enough to know how subtle these situations could be, the way biases hid behind official-sounding rules or protocols. He thought back to Eric's behavior, the way he had scrutinized Shark's ID, the smug tone in his voice, the muttered comment as Shark walked away. It all painted a clear picture. "So what now?" Shark asked. "Do I let it slide? Pretend it didn't happen? Or do I speak up and risk it blowing up into something bigger?" Rick sighed on the other end of the line. "That's up to you, big guy. But if you want my advice, don't rush into anything. Let me gather more information first. If this really is part of a larger issue, we need to be smart about how we handle it." Shark nodded, even though Rick couldn't see him. He trusted Rick to have his back, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He wasn't just thinking about himself anymore. If Eric's behavior was part of a pattern, how many others had faced the same treatment? How many had been dismissed or humiliated without the platform or resources to fight back? The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Shark trying to distract himself by scrolling through social media and catching up on emails. But his mind kept wandering back to the incident. As the jet began its descent, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. He didn't know exactly how he would address it yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about him. After landing, Shaq was met by his driver, who greeted him with a warm smile and a handshake. "Everything all right, Mr. Emil?" the driver asked as he loaded Shaq's bag into the car. Shaq hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I'm good," he said, though his tone betrayed his lingering frustration. He climbed into the car and sat in silence as they pulled away from the airport. Outside the window, the city buzzed with life. People rushing to and from work, vendors lining the streets, the hum of everyday activity. Normally, Shaq found comfort in the energy of the city, but today it only reminded him of how disconnected he felt. By the time Shaq arrived at his hotel, Rick had already sent him a follow-up message. It was a link to an article from a local news site detailing a complaint against Eric from 2 years earlier. The story was brief but damning. A young entrepreneur, also a person of color, had accused Eric of unfair treatment at the same airport. The article mentioned a formal investigation, but the outcome was inconclusive, and Eric had kept his job. Shaq stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. This wasn't an isolated incident, and if there was one complaint on record, how many more had gone unreported or unnoticed? He forwarded the article to Rick with a simple message. Asterisk, we need to dig deeper asterisk. Over the next few days, Shaq tried to focus on his work. He had meetings, appearances, and a charity event to attend, but the airport incident loomed in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Eric's smug grin, the way he seemed to relish the power he held in that moment. It wasn't just about the inconvenience or the embarrassment. It was about the principle. People deserved to be treated with respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Rick continued to dig, and the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to come together. He uncovered another complaint, this one from a musician who had accused Eric of discriminatory behavior during a pre-flight security check. The musician had filed a formal grievance, but it had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Rick also found posts on social media from other travelers who had mentioned encountering issues with Eric, though most of the stories were vague and lacked concrete details. As the evidence mounted, Shaq found himself growing more determined. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for everyone who had been treated unfairly and dismissed. But he also knew he had to tread carefully. If he went public with his story, it would draw significant attention, and not all of it would be positive. The media could twist his words, turning him into the bad guy for speaking out. One evening, as Shaq sat in his hotel room, his phone buzzed with a call from Rick. "I've got something," Rick said, his voice tinged with urgency. "One of the people I spoke to is willing to talk, off the record for now. She used to work at the airport, and she says there's a culture of looking the other way when it comes to certain behaviors." She mentioned Eric specifically. Shaq's eyebrows raised. What kind of behaviors? "Discrimination, Rick replied bluntly. But it's subtle. He doesn't outright break the rules. He bends them just enough to make people feel unwelcome. And from what she said, the higher-ups know about it, but don't want to rock the boat. He's been there a long time, and he's good at covering his tracks. Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. This wasn't just about Eric anymore. It was about a system that allowed people like him to thrive. Did she say why she left the airport? Shaq asked. She didn't go into details, Rick said, but it sounded like she got tired of the environment. She said it was exhausting, always having to fight against the status quo. Shaq nodded slowly, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This was bigger than he had imagined. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to prevent others from experiencing the same treatment. As he hung up the phone, Shaq stared out the window at the city lights. He thought about his platform, his voice, and the responsibility that came with them. He had spent his career inspiring people on and off the court. Now he had a chance to stand up for something that mattered, something that went beyond basketball, beyond fame, beyond himself. The path ahead wasn't clear, but Shaq knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a single encounter at an airport. This was about fairness, respect, and the kind of world he wanted to help create. And no matter how difficult the journey, he was ready to take the first step. Over the following days, Shaq's resolve hardened. He wasn't sure how to navigate this storm, but he knew he couldn't let it pass without action. The weight of doing nothing felt heavier than the risks of speaking out. Yet, the stakes were high. Shaq was aware that taking a stand might bring scrutiny to his personal life and ignite a firestorm in the media. Despite this, the thought of letting someone else fall victim to the same treatment pushed him forward. Rick continued to unearth more pieces of the puzzle. Each discovery painted a troubling picture of Eric's history at the airport. Former colleagues described him as a stickler for rules, but only when it suited him. He had a knack for exploiting grey areas, using protocol as a shield while enforcing unwritten biases. The worst part, those who had spoken out in the past seemed to face an uphill battle. Their complaints were quietly dismissed, buried under claims of insufficient evidence or misunderstandings. One night, Rick called Shaq with an update that stopped him in his tracks. "You're not going to believe this," Rick said, his tone grave. "There's surveillance footage from the airport. It doesn't capture audio, but it shows Eric interacting with you. And let's just say, the body language speaks volumes. But here's the kicker. There are clips from other incidents too. The patterns are all there." Shaq leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "How'd you get this?" he asked. "A contact who wants to stay anonymous," Rick replied. "They couldn't give me everything, but what I've seen is enough to raise serious questions. The way Eric behaves in these situations, it's clear he singles certain people out. It's subtle, but it's there." Shaq sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of Rick's words sinking in. This wasn't just about confronting one man. It was about exposing a system that allowed this behavior to persist. The thought filled him with equal parts determination and dread. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I think it's time to involve a legal team," Rick said. "If this goes public, we need to make sure you're protected. But more importantly, we need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug again. The footage could be a game changer, but we need to handle it carefully." Shaq agreed, though the idea of lawyers and lawsuits made his stomach churn. He wasn't looking for a fight, but it seemed the fight had found him. He decided to reach out to a trusted attorney, someone who had helped him navigate complex situations in the past. The attorney, a sharp and seasoned professional named Carla, wasted no time diving into the case. Carla reviewed the evidence Rick had gathered, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When she finally looked up, her eyes met Shaq's with a mixture of concern and determination. "This isn't just about one man abusing his power," she said. "This is about an institution turning a blind eye. If we go forward with this, it's going to get messy. Are you ready for that?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been through this and didn't have the platform to fight back. Carla nodded. All right, then we're going to do this the right way. But you need to prepare yourself. Once this goes public, there's no turning back. The next steps were a whirlwind. Carla helped Shark draft a formal statement outlining his experience and the evidence they had uncovered. They decided to release the statement through a reputable news outlet, ensuring the story would be taken seriously. At the same time, Carla began building a case against the airport, focusing on systemic issues rather than targeting Eric as an individual. Meanwhile, the tension continued to build behind the scenes. Word of Shark's plans began to circulate, and it wasn't long before the airport's management caught wind of the situation. They issued a carefully worded statement, claiming to take the allegations seriously while also defending their staff. The response felt hollow to Shark, a calculated attempt to deflect blame without admitting fault. As the story gained traction, Shark found himself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters clamored for interviews, social media exploded with debates, and opinions poured in from every corner. Some people praised Shark for taking a stand, calling him a hero for using his platform to address an important issue. Others accused him of seeking attention, twisting the narrative to paint him as a villain. Through it all, Shark stayed focused. He refused to let the noise distract him from his goal. He knew the truth, and he trusted that the evidence would speak for itself. But the pressure was undeniable. Every time his phone buzzed with a new notification, his pulse quickened, wondering what new twist the story might take. Behind the scenes, Rick continued to dig deeper, uncovering more stories from people who had crossed paths with Eric. Each account added another layer to the narrative, painting a clearer picture of a man who had operated unchecked for far too long. But it wasn't just Eric who came under scrutiny. The airport's culture of complacency began to take center stage. Former employees came forward with stories of their own, describing an environment where complaints were discouraged and accountability was scarce. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Shark felt the weight of the situation more than ever. This wasn't just about exposing a single incident. It was about challenging a system that allowed discrimination to thrive. And while he knew the fight was far from over, he couldn't shake the feeling that the climax was drawing near. The tension was at its peak, the stakes higher than ever, and the world was watching. Then, one night, Shark received a call from Rick that changed everything. "I've got something big," Rick said, his voice tinged with excitement. "You need to see this." "What is it?" Shark asked, his heart racing. "It's a document," Rick replied. "An internal memo from the airport. It's not supposed to exist, but it confirms everything we suspected, and more. This could be the smoking gun." Shark's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how Rick had managed to get his hands on the memo, but he knew it was a game changer. The stakes had just been raised, and the next move would be critical. The tension was almost unbearable, the weight of the situation pressing down on Shark as he prepared for what was to come. Shark stared at his phone, Rick's words still echoing in his mind. An internal memo. His thoughts raced as he wondered what this document could reveal. The stakes had already felt sky high, but this new development threatened to push everything over the edge. He had to see it for himself. Rick didn't waste any time. Within minutes, Shark received an encrypted file in his email. He opened it cautiously, his heart pounding as the document loaded. The memo, dated months earlier, was addressed to the airport's security leadership. It outlined concerns about Eric's behavior, detailing complaints from both staff and passengers. The language was carefully sanitized, but the meaning was clear. Eric's actions had been flagged multiple times. Yet, instead of addressing the issues, the memo recommended internal monitoring to avoid public scrutiny. Shark leaned back, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just negligence, it was a cover-up. The airport had known about Eric's behavior and had chosen to sweep it under the rug. The memo even included an ominous line about mitigating risk to the organization, which seemed to suggest that protecting their reputation mattered more than holding Eric accountable. He immediately called Rick. "This changes everything," Shark said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. They knew all along. Rick sighed on the other end of the line. Yeah, and they didn't just look the other way, they actively avoided fixing the problem. This isn't just about Eric anymore. This is about the whole system. Shaq nodded, even though Rick couldn't see him. He had suspected as much, but seeing it in black and white made it real in a way that hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew what this meant. The airport would fight back harder than ever. They'd try to discredit him, spin the narrative, and do everything in their power to protect themselves. As he sat there processing the information, his phone buzzed again. It was Carla. "Shock," she said without preamble. "We need to talk." "What's going on?" Shock asked, bracing himself. "I just got a call from a reporter," Carla said. "They've caught wind of the memo. Someone leaked it to the press." Shaq's stomach dropped. "What? How?" "I don't know," Carla admitted, "but it's out there now. This is going to explode, and we need to be ready." Shaq rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The memo had the potential to shift the entire narrative, but it also put him in an even brighter spotlight. Every move he made from this point forward would be scrutinized, every word dissected. He had wanted the truth to come out, but not like this, not before they were fully prepared. The next morning, the story broke. Headlines blared across news outlets and social media. Asterisk leaked memo, reveals cover-up at major airport. Shaquille O'Neal's case takes shocking turn asterisk, and asterisk discrimination allegations shake aviation industry. Asterisk, the memo was everywhere, and the public response was immediate. Some people expressed outrage, calling for accountability from the airport. Others questioned the authenticity of the memo, accusing Shock of orchestrating the leak to gain sympathy. As the world debated the story, Shaq found himself grappling with a new complication. Rick called him later that day with news that sent his mind spinning. "Shock," Rick said carefully, "there's something else you need to know." Eric's lawyer just made a statement. They're claiming that Eric has been scapegoated by the airport, that the higher-ups are throwing him under the bus to save themselves. Shock blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "What? Are they serious?" "Dead serious," Rick replied. "They're painting him as a victim, saying the airport used him as a fall guy to distract from their own failures. And honestly, it's a smart move. It muddies the waters and shifts some of the heat off the airport." Shock shook his head, trying to process this new twist. The idea of Eric as a victim felt absurd, given everything he had done. But Rick was right. This changed the dynamic. If the airport and Eric were no longer on the same side, it could fracture their defenses or worse, make it harder to hold either party accountable. Carla weighed in later that evening, her voice calm but firm. "This is exactly what we expected," she said. "When people are cornered, they start pointing fingers. The airport wants to protect itself, and Eric wants to protect himself. It's messy, but it could work to our advantage. If they start turning on each other, we might get more information than we expected." Shock listened carefully, her words giving him a glimmer of hope. But the situation felt more volatile than ever. The public was divided, the media was in a frenzy, and now the two parties at the center of the conflict were at odds. It was a perfect storm, and Shock was right in the middle of it. As the days passed, the tension continued to escalate. More stories came to light, both about Eric's behavior and the airport's culture of ignoring complaints. Former employees came forward with damning accounts, while passengers shared their own experiences of mistreatment. But amid the flood of new information, Shaq noticed a troubling trend. Some outlets began focusing less on the broader issue and more on Shock himself, questioning his motivations and picking apart his every move. He knew this was part of the game, but it didn't make it any easier. Every time he opened his phone, he was met with a barrage of headlines, tweets, and opinion pieces. Some were supportive, but others were harsh, accusing him of using his fame to bully an underpaid security guard or claiming he was blowing a minor inconvenience out of proportion. Through it all, Shock kept his focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't about winning a popularity contest. It was about exposing the truth and creating change. But as the conflict reached a boiling point, he couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was about to happen. The memo had been a bombshell, but it wasn't the end of the story. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and Shark knew that when those pieces came to light, everything would change yet again. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and anticipation. The leaked memo had ignited a firestorm, and the airport's leadership was scrambling to contain the fallout. Shaq and his team, meanwhile, were working tirelessly to stay ahead of the narrative. Carla doubled down on her legal strategy, Rick continued to unearth more evidence, and Shark prepared for what felt like the final push. Yet, amidst all the noise, there was an undeniable sense that the real breaking point was still to come. It arrived unexpectedly one evening when Carla called Shark with a tone he hadn't heard from her before, a mix of urgency and disbelief. "Shark," she said, "you're not going to believe this." Eric just flipped. Shark froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's turned on the airport," Carla explained. "His lawyer just issued a statement claiming Eric is ready to cooperate with our case. He's alleging that the airport not only knew about his behavior, but encouraged it in certain situations." Shark sat down, his mind racing. Encouraged it. What does that even mean? Carla took a deep breath. According to Eric, he was pressured to enforce stricter protocols on certain passengers, ones who fit a profile. He claims it was all under the guise of security priorities, but the underlying message was clear. And now he's willing to testify to that in court. Shark couldn't believe what he was hearing. For months, Eric had been the face of the conflict, the personification of the problem. Now he was shifting the blame onto the very system that had protected him. It was a stunning twist, one that reshaped the entire narrative. But as shocking as Eric's confession was, it also raised more questions. Was he telling the truth, or was this just another attempt to save himself? Carla didn't waste any time. She arranged a meeting with Eric's legal team to verify the claims and assess the potential impact on their case. When they sat down, Eric looked like a man under immense pressure. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem almost unrecognizable. "I made mistakes," Eric admitted, his voice shaky but resolute. "I let my biases get the better of me, and I hurt people because of it. But I wasn't acting alone. The airport created an environment where that kind of behavior wasn't just tolerated. It was expected in certain situations." Shark listened intently, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of vindication. As much as he despised what Eric had done, he couldn't ignore the weight of his confession. If what Eric was saying was true, then the problem went far deeper than one man's actions. It was a systemic issue, rooted in a culture of prejudice and complacency. The revelation sent shockwaves through the case. With Eric's cooperation, Carla was able to secure additional evidence that corroborated his claims, emails, internal communications, and even training materials that hinted at discriminatory practices. The evidence was damning, and it left the airport's leadership with little room to maneuver. The climax came during a high-profile press conference, where Shark, Carla, and Rick presented their findings to the public. It was a tense and emotional moment, one that captured the attention of millions. Shark spoke from the heart, addressing not just his own experience, but the broader implications of the case. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about everyone who's been treated unfairly, everyone who's been made to feel less than because of who they are or what they look like. We have to do better, not just as individuals, but as a society." The response was overwhelming. While there were still detractors, the majority of people rallied behind Shark, applauding his courage and determination. The airport, facing mounting pressure, issued a public apology and announced a series of reforms aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had come to light. Eric's testimony played a pivotal role in exposing the truth, and while his actions couldn't be excused, his willingness to come clean helped move the conversation forward. But just when it seemed the story had reached its resolution, another twist emerged. As Carla and Rick continued their work, they discovered something startling. The discriminatory practices Eric had described weren't unique to this airport. Similar policies and patterns of behavior were uncovered at other major airports across the country, suggesting a much larger problem than anyone had anticipated. For Shaquille, the revelation was both sobering and motivating. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. What had started as a personal ordeal had grown into a movement, one that demanded systemic change on a national level. And while the road ahead was daunting, Shaquille felt ready to take it on, knowing he wasn't alone. Together with Carla, Rick, and countless others who had joined the cause, he vowed to keep pushing for justice, no matter how long it took. As he walked out of the press conference, surrounded by supporters and reporters, Shaquille couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had taught him something invaluable. Sometimes, the most challenging battles are the ones that matter most. And as he stepped into the spotlight once more, he knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger story.